So it's my pleasure to be here to listen to the lecture of Prof Sudipta Kaviraj. Now may I request the head of the department, Professor Manjari, to come and introduce the speaker.
Welcome to you all, and I'm very happy to welcome today's distinguished guest, Professor Sudipta Kaviraj from Columbia University. He teaches at the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian and African Studies, and he's an old friend of the Department of Political Science of this university. And whenever we have requested him to come and speak to us, give a talk at the department, he's never said no. So whenever he's in India and we request him to come, he always takes out some time for us to be with us, talk to our students, talk to us all, and generally spend time with us. And he agreed to come and talk to us today in our distinguished lecture series is a privilege for us. It's an honor for us. And many of us have been his students either at JNU or I was at SOAS. I was a student. Professor Arun Patnaik and others were his students at JNU, and so we have had opportunities to listen to him, to interact with him very closely, and right? Yeah. So he was always a very popular teacher, a very patient and engaged teacher. We always saw him as a relentless, tireless researcher, and also a prolific writer. And one thing which we learned from him was that he very deftly blended questions of political theory, philosophical concerns, and contemporary politics, contemporary political issues, to comment upon not only the course of history, but also contemporary issues, contemporary developments in politics, in society, which had to do with not only the political structure, the social structure, but the course of politics, contemporary politics, the way it was flowing before us. And I don't need to say this, but his wide-ranging works, on one hand, from literary criticism to something as contemporary as everyday as examining regional politics, his reach has been quite wide-ranging. He has looked at Marxian thought. He's in fact very firmly rooted in Marxian thought, and he has looked at post-colonial theory. I mean, at his hands, the post-colonial theory has also grown, before us, the post-colonial scholarship, and to literary thought, to comment upon analysis of democracy in India. So he has written widely on a wide range of issues. And his latest work, which came out in 2015, was called Invention of Private Life, Literature and Ideas, where he's grappling with literary theory, sociology, politics, philosophy, and again, as I said earlier, the blend of all these to make a very profound comment about today's politics. I don't want to take too much of your time. I'm here to welcome him, but a detailed introduction would be given by Professor Arun Patnaik. And I welcome him again, and on behalf of the department, on behalf of the university, And I'm very happy that Professor Prakash Babu, PVC, was able to come and address the gathering and chair the session. So now I want to call upon Professor Patnaik to introduce the speaker. Thank you.
Professor Prakash Babu, Pro VC, Professor Sudipta Kaviraj and friends. It is really an honor to introduce Professor Kaviraj, whom I know for a long time, and some of his students who are senior to me, they are also sitting here. They came all the way from Chennai, various parts of Hyderabad to listen to him. It's really privileged to see the galaxy of former JNU students in this hall. Professor Kaviraj is a specialist in intellectual history and Indian politics. Mandare has already outlined some of them. He works in the two fields of intellectual history, Indian social and political thought in 19th and 20th century, and modern Indian literature and cultural production. There are two different fields of intellectual history. His other fields of interest research include the historical sociology of the Indian state and some aspects of Western social theory. He received his PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Prior to joining Columbia University, he taught at the Department of Political Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. He has also taught political science at JNU, where we happened to meet him and we were students. He was also an Augusta Harrison Fellow at St. Anthony's College, Oxford, and he was a member of the Subaltern Studies Collective for a long time. Among many of his books, Kaviraj's linked trilogy of Indian society and politics, the first title, Imaginary Institution of India, the second, The Enchantment of Democracy in India, and the third, The Trajectories of Indian State, published in 2010, is a very significant contribution to Indian studies and Indian sociology. A recent work which Mandari referred, The Invention of Private Life, Literature and Ideas, remains an inspiring volume for students of literature, sociology and political theory. His other significant works include Civil Society, History and Possibilities, co-edited with Sunil Khilnani in 2001, Politics in India, edited by him in 1999, and the NIP Consciousness, Bankim Chattopadhyay and the Formation of Nationalist Discourse in India in 1995, Perspectives of Capitalism, Marx, Keynes, Schumpeter and Weber, co-edited with the famous economist Krishna Bharadwaj in 1989. These are all very seminal contributions. In fact, some of these works have inspired a large number of us over a period of time. And in fact, it will be incomplete if I don't say anything about Kaviraj's teaching, because that's where his strength lies, in the way he inspired. In fact, one of the title of his book is Enchantment of Democracy. He was actually an enchanting teacher, and so much so that some of the senior students would bail me out. A large number of students from Delhi University used to attend his classes. It's very interesting that large number of students used to come, so they were so attracted by his teaching. In fact, he used to describe, Professor Kaviraj used to describe Professor Randir Singh as a phenomenal teacher, whereas we students in JNU used to describe him as our phenomenal teacher. That's really very enchanting teaching and very attractive. One thing I learned from his classroom lecture is that he used to introduce the intellectual tradition with many facets. Every intellectual tradition has many facets, many diversities, and that was his important. When he taught Marx or Hegel, he brought many dimensions in them. He paid attention to what he used to teach us, that we must try to avoid binary thinking of an intellectual tradition. He was firmly anchored in the Aristotelian legacy of golden mean, and he ruthlessly avoid extreme interpretations. He is a man of humility, man of sobriety, and he symbolizes in his teachings. His teaching symbolizes spirit. His calm presence in the classroom used to excite most of us, and some of us were excited to even criticize him, but he would give a cheerful smile and ward off your critical mindset. And some of the comrades were aggressive, and yet he used to counter them gently, and he was that type of a very calm demeanor actually. He won't dismiss any intellectual tradition while offering a critique. It is very important. Notice this legacy. That's why it is always easy for a student of different ideological persuasion to even engage him in a dialogue. He would talk to people of different political persuasions for hours together without getting bored, without getting dismissal of their viewpoint. And you listen to capacity to listen to students was very enormous, and that, I think that continues to be so elsewhere as well. In my view, that remains his outstanding quality. I would end with an anecdote. Once we had organized a seminar on a theme I forget, where Vipan Chandra and Kaviraj were the speakers. And after the meeting was over, as usual, we retired for cups of tea, and we went to JNU canteen, and we had a prolonged discussion there. And Vipan Chandra was dismissal of suggestions by students. Kaviraj would listen to everybody and keep quiet. Then sometimes students felt restless with Professor Vipan Chandra and said, "Sir, you are dismissing everything that we say." Then he said, "If you want appreciation, you talk to Kaviraj. He will give a contextual justification of all your contributions." And so therefore that was his spirit. I don't remember exactly the context of this the debate. I was struggling to recall. But that was actually his spirit. His spirit was always to listen to a different point of view, not dismiss offhand, and pay a lot more attention to it, and then give a response. So with this, I bring an end to the introduction to Professor Kaviraj. So thank you very much.
Now may I request Professor Sudipta Kaviraj to deliver his talk.
So I'm grateful to the University of Hyderabad, to the VC, Pro VC, and the Departments of Political Science and Sociology for the invitation to give the lecture in memory of B.R. Ambedkar, one of the major figures to study in the analysis of modern political thought, which is basically my field. I'm not an Ambedkar scholar, nor am I entitled to speak about Dalit history or thinking. So I shall speak about a question that I find fascinating in the study of Indian thought, the question of history. Ambedkar has a distinctive place in this tradition precisely because, although the lack of historical records is a general problem for Indian history, the Dalit perspective that Ambedkar brings to it enters into very different kinds of questions about our relation to our past. What I shall talk about this evening is a bit unusual for my subject, political theory. In reading political theory, we enter into a world primarily of argumentation, of clear statements, clarifications, counter-arguments, conclusions. Today's subject is more akin to the study of literary themes, of aesthetic judgment and historical melancholy. Yet, it is also about a major political theorist from modern India and about a major concern he carried throughout his life, a question that has a peculiar eruptive presence in his writings, because it's a question that he cannot resolve and yet cannot abandon. Looking at the paintings of an artist, like, let's say, Caravaggio, we cannot avoid an overwhelming and looming sense of the darkness of his palette. A metaphysical darkness at the core of his world seems always trying to burst onto the canvas. We often have that sense in reading the work of poets, that human existence is tinged with an indelible layer of melancholy, a predominant rasa that permeates not a single work, but the totality of their production. Reading Ambedkar, one can feel the presence of a similar, ineradicable tone of grief, a tone in both senses of the word, like an oral tone of music or a tone of color in painting. But because some reasons strongly related to the internal features of political theory as a genre of reflection, there is a strange obstruction in the path of expression of this grief. My paper seeks to understand the nature of this obstruction, and its transcendence in Ambedkar's long reflection, always interrupted and always resumed, on the elusive history of untouchability. We cannot read political theory entirely divested of the techniques of reading literature. Though we always feel this is less important, all works of political theory are written, in the philosopher Frege's sense, in a particular tone. By a preliminary distinction between sense and tone, Frege separated all questions not related to sense and quarantined them into a residual concept so that they did not intrude into his subsequent analysis of how language carried different meanings of meaning. This distinction immediately opens up an interesting prospect for readings of political theory. Clearly, in addition to the readings we subject them to, texts of political theory could be read in terms of tone as well. When we read Hobbes and Locke, for instance, we encounter a clear tone distinction between Hobbes's defiantly provocative, mocking tone against the dominant Christian ideas about the nature of man, the presence of God, the impact of religion on human life, and Locke's utterly different tone of acceptance of the deep reasonableness of Christian doctrines, like the world as a gift of God to all men in common, only to be entirely transcended by the powerful enunciation of a theory of unlimited accumulation of property in the next few pages of that chapter. Tone is a perfectly possible subject of analysis in reading political theory, and if we decide to supplement the reading of theoretical sense with the reading of linguistic tone, we can supplement our conventional reading of techniques of literary theory. In case of Ambedkar and the kind of critical theory that he represents, an analysis of tone leads to more fundamental theoretical insights. Among modern Indians, Ambedkar was undoubtedly a most skillful user of the liberal language of political thinking. What I mean by language here should be explicated more clearly. Language is not something that we use voluntarily and optionally when we are taking steps in a particular process of actual reasoning. Language in this sense refers to something more underlying and profound, something that both enables and limits our thought. It's a fundamental way of conceiving of what the political world is really like, what can be done to it, and in what ways. Politics in Ambedkar's world are dominated by at least three different languages. First, there is a fundamental distinction between a pre-modern and a modern language, which are entirely asymmetric. A pre-modern language drawn from the concepts and arguments through which texts like the Arthashastra, the Manusmriti, Shukraniti, Kamandakiniti Shastra, etc. develop their thinking and their judgments, is evidently inadequate, lacking in conceptual resources for thinking through the modern world. From Bankim Chandra, we are irrevocably in a world of modern thinking, in which it's perfectly possible for authors to adopt an anti-modernist stance, but their intellectual tools are drawn all from modernist languages, not from the depleting vocabulary of pre-modern reflection. Because the nature of modern power is so profoundly different from the ontology of the political world about which they thought and offered judgments. That leaves us with the modern linguistic universe, which was the universe that Ambedkar made his own. To characterize an author like Ambedkar strictly, we have to discern the defining features of his thinking. First, it is entirely modern. Ambedkar had a total irreverence towards the antiquity of his society, except Buddhism. He believed there was little valuable, serviceable, or morally defensible in the heritage of Hindu thought. Inside the universe of modern politics, Ambedkar is clearly in favor of the language of liberalism. That is the language of his unmistakable choice. That is the heritage that he draws upon and exalts in his polemics against nationalist doctrines that gave priority to the political over social reform. That is the language that he wields to denounce the practices of caste in Hindu society, the language he uses masterfully in the detailed and constantly shifting context of constitutional deliberations, and the language he deploys with precision and foresight in the great opportunity he gets in shaping the Indian Constitution. His relation with Western liberalism, however, I would be happy to have a discussion about this, however, is not quite straightforward. It required constant refinement and modification, but I am concerned with something that appears to me to be both more elusive and more profound in his thinking. Ambedkar's writing shows two types of affiliation to liberal thought. Like many of his contemporaries, he was clearly attracted by the high rationalistic tradition of the Enlightenment, emphasizing particularly two strands of thinking: of uncompromising rationalistic critique of religion and the high liberal fervor for the expansion of liberty. Ambedkar's affiliation to the liberal language of political thought comes very early and is entirely decisive and irreversible. Ambedkar saw Indian Marxism as a form of thought entirely trapped in a Eurocentric obsession with economically defined class, unable to recognize the obvious and profound form of inequality in their own society present in caste. Eventually, Ambedkar became a real master of the theoretical language of liberalism. Dewey's influence at Columbia seems to have been profound and methodologically critical, because Dewey was an innovative thinker of liberal doctrine and applied it to new questions and fields of inquiry. For instance, Dewey was a very interesting thinker about the connection between a liberal society and education. This seems to have shown Ambedkar that the meaning of being a good liberal was not an obstinate repetition of its catechisms, but elaboration of his central moral principles towards new analytical domains. So he did for India what he thought Dewey was doing in the American context. He did more than anyone else to construct a radical form of liberal politics in the context of Indian political life. The question of Ambedkar's relation not to the doctrine but to the language of socialism is, however, an interesting one. Liberalism is less outraged by inequality than socialism is. And I believe that though doctrinally Ambedkar rejects Marxism, there is a subterranean presence of a language of outrage that draws from a socialist vocabulary and the socialist tone. That's why, to my mind, the tone is very important. On one question, however, the two languages of liberalism and socialist thinking were fundamentally similar. Both languages of modern political thought emerge from a shared secular tradition, but secularity works here in a peculiarly fundamental sense. In the great early modern thinkers like Hobbes, the business of politics is increasingly conceived as mundane in an intensified sense. Generally, these thinkers did not question the existence of God or his perceptible presence in the world. But it seemed clear to them, to people like Hobbes, that divine presence is not regarded as a reliable protection from the possible predations of the modern state. In a sense, the whole business of political theory and constitutionalism, which was at the center of Ambedkar's thinking, emerged from this gap, absence, or flaw in the world's mundane arrangements. To secure political justice, to find protection against a state turned hostile, the presence of a hidden God was not a reliable remedy. As a modernist, Ambedkar assumes that rules of morality must be marked by a form of what can be called Kantian universalism. A tenet that is good for one person must be good for all. Otherwise, it did not qualify as a moral rule. Drawing on this line of thought, he could argue that the detailed instructions of differential punishments, for instance, in the Manusmriti, was a travesty of the very conception of a moral rule. The Manusmriti in particular was outrageous, not because its rules were degrading and discreetly indefensible, but because it was premised on a monstrous misconception about the nature of morality itself. He could have gone forward and claimed, alongside his startling claim that Hinduism did not constitute a society, that Hindu texts of this kind also did not have a conception of morality. It's often noted that philosophical materialism leads to a kind of experiential presentism. Since what is happening to us in the present moment has an immediate effect on us in all senses, materially and intellectually, it gets a natural preponderance in our attention. Abstractly, the past and the future might be equally significant parts of time, conceived in the abstract sense, but in this sense, they are less materially pressing than the time of the present. If we can notice this uneven emphasis on different segments of time, past, present, and future, we could say that we can detect an underlying latent structure of temporality in every kind of political theory about how they treat past, present, and future differentially. I'm using temporality in a special narrow meaning, temporality in my use, in not just a fancier name for time, but the way time, which is necessarily abstract, is given a structure, something akin to a shape, by stressing some of its parts at the expense of others. It will be seen that modern political theory, in both its dominant forms of liberalism and Marxism, are futuristic in a rather narrow sense, in the sense that because the present is still happening and the future is yet to happen, the political activity of seeking justice and social equality must be oriented towards these two segments of time, particularly the present. At times, this bias in favor of present experience and materiality, the prejudice simply in favor of a simple existence itself, is seen to have troubling consequences in liberal judicial rules. I'll give you a notorious English example. Two young boys of 10 and 12 bludgeoned a toddler to death. In their trial and afterwards, the entire orientation of the judicial process seems to be to ensure that the perpetrators, these two boys who killed the toddler, were treated with the care we owe to children, hastening their rehabilitation as moral persons so that they can enjoy a successful human life when they come out of prison. The mother of the toddler agitated against this entire procedure because she thought that the justice for her child, who was also a moral person, is sacrificed. But the argument goes down to a brutal rock bottom, where the basic point of persuasion is that the lives of the two perpetrators are still existent in the present and possibly in the future. The life of the toddler, unfortunately, is impossible to continue. And therefore, there cannot be reasonable suspension of moral considerations, of extension of moral considerations or of care towards him, as he is now incapable of being cared for. An argument that is at bottom very similar would be advanced by both liberal and socialist theory implicitly regarding questions like instances of atrocities in the long, irrevocable past. Both theories would, according to their lights and to their respective principles, demand a politics of justice for groups who are wronged. Liberal theory would recommend social initiatives and state action to counteract practices of social injustice like caste, and socialists would invoke them to counteract poverty. But both types of social theories are secular and materialistic in this common sense, that they would strain every nerve to eradicate such practices. Think of slavery in the modern West and the continuing degradation and denial of equal rights to people of color and women in the West. Liberal and socialist theory carried on real moral crusades against these social wrongs, eventually to some success. Yet these theories are indifferent toward the past. At most, they might regard the evidence of the past subjection of groups to inegalitarian atrocity as a deplorable aspect of the society's history. But eventually they have a deep, active orientation towards society. Their central question after the necessary work of moral judgment is concluded is what can be done now? What can we do to right these wrongs? The trouble with history is the irreversible inaccessibility of the past to present action, and the fact that because of that pastness, somehow, the crucial phrase, what can we do about it, becomes inoperative and ineffectual. Action is rendered impossible simply by the obstructing tenets of the case. Action is barred, deflected. The demand for action rebounds, in a sense, from the temporal surface of the historical past. The eventual attitude of futuristic, future-oriented, and action-oriented theories is to accept silence. This was true of social theory in Ambedkar's time, though in recent times new speculation has begun on some of these questions. A reading of Ambedkar immediately reveals two things. Ambedkar's fluent and mastery of the language of liberalism, as I said, but also his deep melancholy at the idea which that language seems to force upon us, that we should necessarily accept the silence that I considered just now. Consider three of his texts, which circle back explicitly to this question of origin and the injustice of this silence. The first is probably the most academic piece, Castes in India, their mechanism, genesis, and development. I would want you to look at it literally, because every word, has a weight. Their mechanism, genesis, and development. Presented for the ethnology seminar at Columbia with A.A. Goldenweiser in 1916, later published in Indian Antiquity in 1917. 20 years later, he wrote The Annihilation of Caste as a lecture to be delivered at the Jat Path Todak Mandal reform organization, which demanded editing and dropping some passages they found unacceptably radical, making him refuse their invitation. But precisely for its uncompromisingness, that essay remains a major statement of Ambedkar's thinking. In 1946, he published Who Were the Shudras, which was linked to the extension of this historical inquiry into the further question, Origins of Untouchability, published after independence in 1948. So what I shall do is, I have a very long paper in which I go into all these different texts in great detail. I don't have time to go into all that, so I'll simply give you the example of the first text and then go on to make the other more theoretical remarks. In the introduction to this essay, there is a subtle insertion of a move that marks a departure from the accepted methods of the discipline he was studying at Columbia. I quote Ambedkar, "A student of ethnology is much like a guide to a historical site like Pompeii," Ambedkar writes. He holds up the social institutions to view with all the objectiveness humanly possible and inquires into their origins and function. The sentence seems unremarkable, yet it contains a surplus or supplementary question that was entirely outside the normal science methods of anthropology of his time. To understand how a social institution works, of course, scholars must grasp how its constituent elements actually function and explore, if possible, how it, that is, its way of functioning, came into existence. So there are two questions. One is the question of functioning, and the other one is the origin of that functioning at some point in history. We must remind ourselves that when he was writing this paper, Ambedkar had been studying anthropology in Columbia, one of the premier institutions in this field at the time, for 3 years, presumably absorbing the methodology that demarcates this field off from two neighboring disciplines which also study human societies and their institutions, the conventional discipline of history and the more recent one of sociology. At their origin, disciplines tend to be particularly sensitive and insistent about their methods because these precisely separate it off from other competing ones. Why did academic knowledge need a discipline called ethnography or anthropology when it already had these two others? The answer has to be methodological. Ambedkar himself notes without expressing any discomfort that the seminar was concerned with the fundamental distinction between primitive and modern societies, and it was now his turn to entertain, I'm quoting him, his co-participants with a paper which showed the mechanism, genesis, and development of castes in India. Yet the primitiveness of societies which ethnology dealt with was of a special kind, precisely the kind of society which were incontrovertibly primitive, that is, which had continued for long spans of time, yet which did not have reliable records of how this time was spent. Societies that were recordless, without history within quotes, and consequently, in these societies, the primitiveness had to be read off from a kind of timeless, that is, time-suppressing present. Primitive is a technical term of methodological art. Primitive is not equivalent to ancient. Use of the term ancient implies that it's a state that is left behind, followed by something else, which acts as a foil to give the term ancient its precise semantic content. History deals with ancient societies. Ethnology has to resolve the puzzle of primitiveness. Anthropologists did not produce history. They produced an alternate for historical knowledge by showing how these societies had a structure, how exactly its parts were linked to each other, and how these were functionally connected, a method which would be called structural functionalism later on. This was, of course, the privileged method for studying the working of societies, which were presumably primitive, but whose lack of history deflected the historical question. They lived in an unhistorical time, lapse of time without evidence of change. The self-knowledge of these societies had a surface or character from which historical questions, when, why, how, bounced off without bite. Techniques of history did not have materials they could grasp. Therefore, these had to be subjected to the methodologies of a freshly minted discipline. History and anthropology did not compete or intersect in their epistemic fields or their cognitive methods. They did quite different things. For a student who had studied under a disciple of Franz Boas, because Goldenwasser was a student of Boas, in one of the first departments of anthropology, this move was not part of normal science. The paper's actual analysis first addresses the question of mechanism, how the institution functions in the strong and peculiar sense that the discipline of anthropology was conferring on this verb. After critically assessing several authors who sought to define caste by some special defining characteristic, Ambedkar follows the work of Dr. Ketkar, who is, in his words, both a native and has an open mind, to make two arguments. The first, which is remarkable at this very early stage of anthropology, is his conviction that trying to define caste by some special feature or a single principle is inadequate. Caste is a structural fact. What creates caste, to deploy a much later terminology, is the dominance of a structure. As you know, this is the term I take from Althusser. He also makes a second argument which partly chimes with the insight of the structural character of the caste order. Caste depends on endogamy. He says, endogamy is the only characteristic that is peculiar to caste. But this is followed by an odd methodological claim, and I quote him, "If we succeed in showing how endogamy is maintained, we shall practically have proved the genesis and also the mechanism of caste." End of quote. Ambedkar recognizes that there are a great many pitfalls in the paths of those who try to unfold the past, and caste is India, to be sure, is a very ancient institution. This is especially true where there exists no authentic or written records, or where the people, like the Hindus, are so constituted that to them writing history is a folly. For the world is an illusion. But the methodological technique to use in case of such obdurately ahistorical cultures is to import the scientific techniques of paleontology. I quote him, as often as not, customs and morals are like fossils that tell their own story. End of quote. He notes that the question of origin is always an annoying question, and in case of caste, this question has been sadly neglected. Later, Ambedkar clear-sightedly acknowledges the limits of a historical explanation. He wants to elucidate the mystery of the growth and development of caste. Unfortunately, a direct answer to this question is not within my power. I can only answer it indirectly. The indirect answer he gives to this question again comes in two parts. Discounting the great man theory of history, which would attribute an act of a Solonian inscription to the edicts of Manu, he concludes, the spread and growth of the caste system is too gigantic a task to be achieved by power or cunning of an individual or a class. Rather, the task of anthropology is to show the falsity of the attitude that has exalted religious sanction to the position of scientific explanation. Simply describing the Shastric injunctions of the Manusmriti does not constitute an explanation of the caste system, simply a demonstration of the availability of recondite justifications from the Brahmins. Brahmins, in order to ensure purity of blood, at some point institute endogamy within themselves, sealing the boundary between themselves and the rest of society. Subsequently, following the Tardian principle of hierarchy, I think he was familiar with Tard because he was a major French sociology at his time. That is, the emulation of the customs of superior groups by their inferiors in a social scale. Other castes imitatively adopt endogamy, generating the familiar system of a completely impermeable system of social differences. Interestingly, despite its intellectual sophistication, the paper used the methodological techniques of early-stage structuralist anthropology, which can and does address only the question of mechanism. Ambedkar's search for history, in a sense, fails. The question of genesis is turned from a historical question of origins to a structural elaboration of functions. Fails not in the sense that Ambedkar fails. It actually shows that it's a question to which it's very difficult to find an answer in principle. The question of how caste originated remains unanswered in the early academic writing. When we go through Ambedkar's repetitive forays into the past, we detect an iterative structure. Iterative in the sense that he comes back again and again. For any historical event or institution which is a fact of a different kind, the question of origin, when and how did it come about, is an entirely legitimate one. The discipline of history has the specialized task of answering questions of this kind reliably with the evidence from its archives. Of course, there is no guarantee that all historical questions can be satisfactorily answered according to the standards of epistemic validation. When intellectuals begin to think about the past, there are many significant occasions when, though the question is paramount for some historiographic need, an answer does not seem to appear to be possible. That is the reason for the iterative, constantly repeated attempts by the same author to try something different from the arguments deployed earlier. These are questions that the authors cannot answer, but also cannot let go or want to turn now to some consideration of this question. How much of time do I have? Should I have 3-4 pages. Can I go on? Okay. I don't want to test your patience too much. A positivist history advanced and its methodological structures and rules were explored and elaborated. As positivist history advanced and its methodological structures and rules were explored and elaborated, it became clear that the cognition or exploration of the past was an internally heterogeneous activity. Many different, methodologically distinct cognitive projects were subsumed under the general appellation of history. Positivist historical science of the 19th century sought to reduce the cluster of these diverse approaches to the past and reserve the title history only to the modern enterprise of knowing the past with clarity and accuracy with the help of specific types of evidentiary rigor. Alongside the demand for accuracy and chronological precision, additional methodological requirements were announced. Use of any method implied a separation between subjectivity of the inquirer and the abstract truth of the cognitive process. Following a specified method ensured that different knowing subjects could fit into the cognitive subject positions and carry on their enterprise uncontaminated by the conditions of individuality and space-time variability. Nietzsche's philosophical speculations disturbed the symmetries of this early methodological orthodoxy of positivist history. And not surprisingly, much of the recent questioning of history and methods has been carried on under Nietzsche's banner. To carry the argument forward, I want to use an argument related to Nietzsche. It doesn't come from Nietzsche himself. This is about genealogy. In his well-known late work, Truth and Truthfulness, the analytic philosopher Bernard Williams made a bold suggestion about the meaning of genealogy. Williams's discussion on the concept is linked to a reading of Nietzsche that I do not find entirely textually persuasive. So my point is not that Williams's reading of Nietzsche is right, but what I'm saying is that what Williams then says about the content of the term genealogy, I find very evocative and helpful for understanding a whole lot of context. He evidently thought that this is what Nietzsche meant by the use of the term. By genealogy, Williams thought Nietzsche meant a question that bears a logically historical form, which is highly significant for some people for understanding something crucial about themselves, but which could not be answered by accepted techniques of historical inquiry. This description should be seen to be fairly similar to what I have described as Ambedkar's puzzle about the past. Interestingly, Williams does not treat this mode of thinking as a failed historical enterprise, as history that has gone wrong or wayward, an inquiry that began as a historical understanding but lost its way and ended up elsewhere at an unexpected and altered, inappropriate cognitive destination. To Williams, it's a separate kind of cognitive enterprise. He treats this as a form of thinking used by thinkers who have an insistent past-related question for resolving which cognitive resources of conventional positivist history are not sufficient. That he takes this kind of thinking seriously is attested by the illustration he offers for this mode of thought. As an example of such genealogical thinking, Williams offers one of the most influential figures of thought in the tradition of Western political theory, the idea of the state of nature and social contract. At the time of the rise of the modern state, Western political theories faced two related questions. The first was a generalized historical puzzle: how did we get here in the Western modern societies to this particular condition? The second was a related but narrower question: how did the state come to be? How did it emerge in history? To none of these questions did Western political theory as a philosophical discipline offer a credible historical answer. The great answer provided to this question, which we have all read in the endless reading of political theory, the great answer provided to this question, which was both historically significant and intellectually fascinating, was through a fable of a social contract. The question was, how did something like the modern state, so vital to social functioning and political experience of human beings, come into existence? An historical answer in the positivist sense would have patiently tracked the prior stages of time through the feudal state towards Roman and Greek antiquity, and if possible beyond. In fact, the answer, within quotes, supplied by contract theory, followed an entirely different methodological procedure. Clearly, this was not an historical answer by any definition. However, this answer remained plausible because of the ambiguity of the original question. How did this come to be? How is it possible? Because ambiguous, this question could be first interpreted in two ways and then answered. The first reading of the question, how is it possible, how did this come to be, is historical. What are the concrete events and stages through which this state of affairs came to exist in the world? But a second interpretation of the question, how is this possible, admits of another kind of construction. The group that asks this question must find a way of giving it an answer that makes sense, produces an interpretation of its own present condition. The fable of a state of nature from which humanity emerged through a contract was a para-history which showed how this state emerged, with the additional advantage that it showed its development process in a way that made a constitutional agreement with state or royal power possible and necessary. This was a substitute for history, or para-history, that a liberal constitutionalist line of thinking gave to itself to justify its future condition as a liberal state. I think Ambedkar's reflections on the origins and the history of untouchability are in some ways similar. It is easy to see that at every stage Ambedkar asks a question that is historical. How did untouchability as a social institution come into existence? But it becomes clear as well that the historical path to answering this question is obstructed. Ambedkar himself constantly laments the lack of record and archive that makes it possible to give it a truly reliable answer, the only kind of answer that history admits. But from acknowledging this impasse, we as readers of social history can follow two interpretative options. The first is to view some of Ambedkar's surmises at unsuccessful history as historical hypotheses that lack the evidence to bear them out. The second, which is often suggested in a postmodern embrace of uncertainty, is to suggest that history is given by a different group to themselves, that all history is similar, irrespective of evidentiary support, and that this is their history. Because this is the history that Dalits give to themselves. I want to avoid this second line. First, because it undermines one of the basic defining features of the historical enterprise, in spite of all its admitted imperfections and limitations. Secondly, this is also subtly patronizing. It's a condescending idea that although this would not qualify as a history of other groups, this will do for lower castes or untouchable. Treating these as genealogy in this sense helps avoid these two positions. Possibly because Ambedkar was a student of political theory, above all, this kind of reasoning was familiar to him. When the path to direct evidentiary history was obstructed, he took recourse to this alternative route. I wish to end by raising another theme in this study of Ambedkar's thought, returning to the theme of historical melancholia. I have tried to show how, as the leading interpreter of Dalit experience in his time, Ambedkar wanted to transcend the futuristic limitation of liberal and Marxist thinking. Despite a temporal positioning or orientation that instructed him to look at the present closely and keep his face turned firmly toward the future, he turned, often disconsolately, with an ineffable sadness towards the past. That is what these genealogical fragments in his writing, inserted in the middle of structural sociology, or constitutional theorizing are doing. He cannot help but turn back and face the past, although it is clear he knows that this is not his task at hand at that moment. One could argue that this is a strange, out-of-step move for someone like Ambedkar. An obsessive fascination with the past is more understandable when it is nostalgia. I want to make this point precisely because this is not nostalgic in the technical sense. When the writer believes, like Gandhi, that there is something of unsurpassable value in that past that was lost, or is threatened with a loss forever. But Ambedkar's relation to the past is, in a precise sense, totally anti-nostalgic. He is attracted to the past, not because it contains something of a fading paradise. On the contrary, he is drawn to the past because it shrouds an unchronicled historical atrocity, hides a dark stain of suffering on a massive scale. This feeling of shock and wonder gives rise to what Indian aesthetic theory would call a chamatkara, a perception that produces dark and perverse wonder around the entirely legitimate question, how was this possible? Chamatkara can be propelled by a sense of, also by rasa of the bibhatsa. In a sense, this could be an appropriate and profound illustration of how this sentiment of jugupsa, repugnant, abhorrent, or hateful, can create a deep and abiding wonderment in the reflecting human mind. But again, I think we should subject this gesture, despite its fragmentariness, to a serious theoretical analysis. That would reveal a line of reasoning that is hardly sentimental or vague or ambiguous. Rather, it carries an intense emotion that pursues a precisely and clearly defined cognitive object. Justice is the central value of all Ambedkar's social thought. And justice in the widest sense involves a global accounting of all human experience. So I emphasize global meaning not spatially global to this moment, but temporally global, including all that belongs to the same category in past time. So, justice is the central value of all Ambedkar's social thought, and justice in the widest sense involves a global accounting of all human experience. It is the search for justice that drives the powerful argumentation for inclusive nationalism, for constitutional representation, the purposive deployment of the power of the state apparatus to end untouchability and discrimination. But this global account of suffering, frustratingly, can apply only to the present and the future. Modern theory advises us not to feel sentimental about the past, because there is simply nothing that can be done to redeem those lives. But in Ambedkar's view, there is something deeply defeating and monstrous about this resolution to forget. History represents, in its ideal form, a global narrative of human experience. This will mean that there will be forever a huge hole in the middle of the historical record of India. The suffering of human beings in the present might be eradicated, which would mean that probably that suffering would not exist in the future. But there would remain a past in which the human suffering of untouchability was not merely not eradicated, but in a deeper travesty, not even remembered. The people of the present, Ambedkar fears, would wipe away the collective guilt of this society by a colossal act of forgetting in the name of the unavailability of historical record. Ambedkar treats this as a kind of false accounting. If that happens, history would precisely betray its promise. That is why, despite all the difficulties in the path of history, this record of suffering ought to be memorialized so that people whom he called the broken men are not treated to the ultimate insult of forgetting. Political democracy bears a responsibility and a connection to history. The present must make a new accounting of the past, from which silences and forgetting can be removed. At least this forgetting is remembered. His writing in these passages are not failed history or history in a lower register, but a discourse that is not history, but the lost genealogy of untouchability. It is history's permanent neighbor and scourge which follows history like a shadow and reminds it constantly of the moral responsibility lying at the heart of its cognitive failures. Sometimes Benjamin's writings remind me of Ambedkar's writings remind me of Walter Benjamin. One connection is easy to grasp. Both Benjamin and Ambedkar, writing around the same time in two corners of the world, were fascinated by the constitutive presence of structural violence in their social order. A violence so pervasive and unanswerable that it did not have to be manifested in violent acts. I want to draw your attention to a different aspect, not that one, which I think is simpler. To a different aspect, which has not been very pronounced in Ambedkar's writing, again I think because of its theoretical modernism. Benjamin and Ambedkar wrote about the experience of two human groups with the longest and in some ways the deepest history of exclusion known to humanity. Yet Benjamin had a resource that Ambedkar did not. Once I taught a course on Benjamin with a very distinguished colleague at Columbia, Professor Dan Miron, a great scholar of German and Jewish literature. Teaching a class on the thesis on the philosophy of history, I wondered at the strange linguistic coloratura at play in the famous passage that describes the angel of history in Benjamin. Benjamin's semantic imagination was playing around a rather small and typically enigmatic Paul Klee sketch, which he had in his possession. I'll read the passage from Benjamin. It's a very famous passage. I'm sure most of you would have read it. I quote, "A clay painting named Angelus Novus," that is the new angel, shows an angel looking as though he is about to move away from something. He is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned towards the past, where we perceive a chain of events. He sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. This storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned. While the pile of debris before him grows skyward, this storm is what we call progress. End of quote. This is from Benjamin. It's called Thesis on the Philosophy of History. It's in Illuminations and in other collections. Benjamin discovered in the small and spare interior of that sketch an amazingly teeming fullness. The angel had its wings spread out. It could not close its wings because the storm was blowing from paradise. It was looking in dismay at the debris of civilization collecting at his feet. I had for long loved that passage, offering it an uncomprehending admiration. Uncomprehending because I did not understand where the chamatkara of that passage was coming from. No ordinary Marxist could write that passage, which evoked a storm from paradise, an angel with wings, its eyes gaping in wonder, destruction of the world, and also his back turned towards history. Think of a Marxist who can write that without embarrassment. This is certainly not something Benjamin got from the mandatory optimism of the Marxist tradition. Professor Miron, who was teaching with me, solved the puzzle very easily. It was a language Benjamin received through the Jewish prophetic tradition. For thousands of years, European Jews faced a long, unceasing historical disaster. As a people of learning and subtle intelligence, they had stocked and refined their experience of suffering in a vocabulary of a prophetic language for which the world was always at the edge of an apocalyptic end. More than other Marxists, Benjamin became the witness to the end of the Western civilization in the 1930s and 40s, precisely because of this precious, unusual heritage, the legacy of a pre-modern, deeply religious language, which was familiar with the secrets of human suffering and saw suffering as the great thread running through human history. Modern languages, with their compulsory optimism and futuristic orientation, lacked the capacity to express this melancholy. Only a religious and aesthetic language, could. Despised and marginalized, forced to exist outside the village as outcasts, still the Jews recognize the similarity between the Jews and the Dalits here. Despised and marginalized, forced to exist outside the village as outcasts, still the Jews had a treasure that was denied to the Indian untouchables. Jews may not have had an exact chronicle of the history of their persecution, but they had a literature, above all a literature which captured the essence of the experience of history. Denial of education was like a withdrawal of all but the most rudimentary speech. Ambedkar comes back to this again and again. The Dalits lost history from two sides. They had no place in the histories that were ever written because they were not central to that history, but they did not have the resources to write their own, in which they would have been at the center. That does not mean that there is no way of reconstructing reconstructing the Dalit past. The work of Narayana Rao and Shulman, etc., that points out that literature is a great resource. But I'm talking here narrowly in this about history. There is no oblivion greater than being written out of history, so that after 1,000 years, there is no record that you had ever existed. This was at the heart of Ambedkar's struggles with history. Dalit Panthers, a few years after his death, opened up a new horizon of expression of the Dalit experience by harnessing the power of the poetic language. I think these concerns played a role in Ambedkar's embrace of Buddhism at the end of his life, an unexpected turn from the limited prosaic languages of modern politics into a language that was vaster, more many-sided, and much more colorful, and a language that declared dukkha to be at the heart of the human world. Thank you.
Now, house is open for any questions or the discussion.
As I said at the start, I'm not an Ambedkar scholar. I read Ambedkar and I try to read him closely, as you saw in the short academic paper that he wrote. Yeah. Aren't Do you want the mic?
But perhaps also in the embodied nature of history, he would possibly turn to the marginalized groups and think of history as being written on the body. So, in that sense, perhaps.
Yeah, of course. I think, you have touched on something which is, I think, one of the most important, but also one of the most elementary questions of modern social science, where I don't know what you were told when you were being trained as a historian, but I was told when I went to study political science, that you are not studying politics, you are studying political science. And the most important thing is not to see yourself as being part of what you study, which is the pretense of science, in the sense that, I'm sure that scientists are able to do that. And I'm also sure that, social scientists are not able to do it. And the entire discussion about methodology, I personally feel reading Weber through the German tradition, I think sometimes is misunderstood, because sometimes the argument is not that you can achieve objectivity, and so what you write should not include you as part of what you are writing about. I think sometimes even Weber realizes that you cannot do that. You are actually irremediably included in what you study. So therefore, the drawing of the distinction that you are aiming at is bound to be frustrated. But you must try to strain against it and as part of your historical or social science practice. So I think it's a very important question. I think there are many ways of seeing the relationship between inside and outside. One way of seeing the relation between inside and outside is as being part of the cognitive object that you're trying to study. There might also be, a question of being inside and outside in a different sense. I think that comes up in Ambedkar. I teach a course in Columbia, which is called Gandhi and his interlocutor. So I teach Gandhi for about 4 weeks, and then I have, Gandhi and the Hindu nationalists, Gandhi and the Muslim nationalists, Gandhi and Ambedkar, Gandhi Nehru, Gandhi Tagore, etc. And some of the themes in the Gandhi Ambedkar discussion tend to come up again and again. And I think in Ambedkar, there are two things. On the one side, which I think is part of the paradox, necessary paradox of representation. A representative, if you take very well-known political science discussions about representation by scholars like Bernard Mena, etc., they would say that a good representative is somebody who is very similar from one point of view, but also very different from another point. So a good representative of the working class is somebody who comes from the working class, experiences the life of the working class, but he is not somebody who is not able to speak. He's not somebody who is submissive, right? So on every single point, a good leader of the working class, in some ways, must not be like the working class. And I think there's a play of this kind in Ambedkar, because very often Ambedkar there are two strands which are always going on in Ambedkar's thinking. In one strand, he would say that this is what you must understand. We must understand. This is actually experience of the Dalit. And there's another strand where he's constantly saying that, what you take the Dalits to be, or what we expect Dalits to behave like, they mustn't behave like that. They should behave like me, because Ambedkar, in a certain sense, Ambedkar is the great representative of the Dalit, because on the one side he shares the experience, on the other side he does not share what we associate with the experience. He's somebody who is very vocal, he's extremely articulate, he's extremely assertive. So I think your question has a lot of these elements. On the embodiment question, to my mind, it's linked to something else, which is partly the question that Ambedkar was looking at in his paper. That is, if you do not have records, if you do not have standard written records, or other types of records from which you can reconstruct a story, what are the types of evidence that you can see? Evidence which are indelible in a certain sense. So for him, as an ethnologist in Columbia at that time, what is indelible is actually the functioning of the social mechanism, right? So that is something that he could see. But on the other side, I think there are reflections of this in Ambedkar's writing. If you look at them closely, I'm doing that now, that much of the degradation of the untouchable are essentially inscribed on their body. So I think the question of embodiment, not in the abstract sense, but in the very concrete sense, of finding it there, but it also raises a very important interpretative difficulty. Because it's one thing to say that I would find it in the body, or it is embodied, but it's a very different thing if you then go on to ask, what really is written on the body? In fact, is it a bodily gesture? Is it other things surrounding the body? Are these things which are capable of interpretation, which are non-controversial, and things like that? So I think it shows both the necessity of looking at something like that, and it also shows the difficulty of doing that. That's why I believe that the question of subaltern history, a history of groups who are normally not part of history writing, is so interesting but also so difficult. For instance, the history of the Dalits, history of women. I think all these histories are actually much more methodologically demanding and challenging than the history that has been conventionally written.
Because, because of the questions that Ambedkar raised about the lack of information and data and sources and so on. And it was only later on in his life that he was drawn to Buddhism and, uh, within the Buddhist tradition, in terms of literature and sources, especially the dialogues of the Buddha, there are very strong critiques of the caste system, its origin, and so on and so forth. And these almost ridicule the Brahmanical position.
Sure.
So, is anywhere there a discussion of these? And these conversations, many times the Buddha in his lifetime is supposedly having with the Brahmins. Like
You know,
to
I'm not a good person to ask this question because I'm not qualified to answer the question. But let me respond on the basis of what I know. Of course, the Buddhist tradition itself, I think, is one of the most important rejections of Brahmanism in some fundamental way. Not in everything, because sometimes I think we have a kind of exaggeratedly romantic history of Buddhism, which turns Buddhism into something like sort of modern radical thought. We must understand that the Buddhism comes from an ancient world. But in any case, there is no doubt that, on some of these questions, particularly on the question of caste, Buddhism is radically different. But I think, if you look at my question technically, that I think the heart of my question about Ambedkar, which I think is Ambedkar's question, is that if you say that you are concerned about justice, justice actually involves all human beings. There's also something that sometimes comes in religious thought, but I wouldn't go into that. Tagore, for instance, has a very beautiful line in a poem which is about human suffering during his time, and he has a phrase which I find an extremely evocative phrase. He says, "Bishyer Bhandari Shudhibena Aturin." That is, there's an accountant of the universe, right? And he records everything. And there's a debt that the universe owes to people who have been treated unjustly. And his question is that, wouldn't the account of the universe arrange it in such a way that this debt would be, the debt would be repaid? So that question of having a Bishyer Bhandari, an accountant of the universe, a secularized version of that is history. And that is where the great, not the cognitive dignity of history, but the moral dignity of history comes from. Because history is the archive, of human experience. And I think Ambedkar's question, if you develop it philosophically, then it's like this, that if justice is demanded by all human beings, suppose tomorrow I create a situation where no Dalit is discriminated against, right? But what about the people who have lived for thousands of years, right, under injustice? What can we do to them? And liberalism and Marxism both would, in effect, say that there's nothing that you can do about this, right? So stop asking that question. But I think there's something in Ambedkar which I find very remarkable, that he thinks that there's some injustice in not struggling with that question itself, despite the difficulty. So the question about Buddhism, my response to your point about Buddhism is, of course, that is true. But what Buddhism offers us, at least in my view, is a kind of ethical critique of Brahmanism. But an ethical critique of Brahmanism is not the recording of history of suffering. It could be, in fact, it's a great question. I can ask some of my friends who are Buddhism scholars, whether in the chronicles of Buddhism, you have evidence of Yeah. Yeah, yeah. No, that is true. There I entirely agree with you. And that's why I think one way of reformulating the discussion between you and me would be that, we could say to Ambedkar that if it is the record of human experience, right, that record did not come always in the form of modern history, right? And there's a lot of writing before. Some of that probably were in oral traditions which were later on collected. But that is a huge archive, of discontent of Indian, with the Brahminical system. And I entirely agree with you that, the attitude that the past has nothing to teach us, I think is an ignorant attitude. I think it's a combination of ignorance and arrogance, which is particularly lethal. And I have just one. Let me make one critical comment about Ambedkar because that's linked to this thing. I think Ambedkar actually totally exaggerates the power of the Brahminical tradition, right? At least on the intellectual side. Let me tell you why I made that modification on the intellectual side. I think if you look at the history of religious life in India, Buddhism does not end with Buddhism. I have a friend of mine at Harvard who's a great scholar of Buddhism. His name is Charlie Hallisey. He once organized a conference in which he invited me. I gave a paper on Tagore. But the title of the conference was Buddhism Outside Buddhism. And part of the discussion was how much of Buddhism, religious ideas which emerged in opposition to Vedic understanding of what religious life was, which is what is peculiar about Buddhism, later on got fragmented and got absorbed namelessly in traditions which are Hindu traditions. Like some aspects of Shaivite tradition in Kashmir, gradually into the Vaishnavite tradition, right? Ultimately flowing into the Bhakti movement, etc. And Ambedkar has a tendency to to have a picture of the Hindu world which is excessively homogeneous. But Ambedkar could say something to this, to this argument, because I come from Bengal and I also come from a town which is associated with Chaitanya. I come from Navadvip, which is Chaitanya's birthplace. So that is the center of Bengali Vaishnavism. But what I find very interesting is that if you read Chaitanya, like the Chaitanya Charitamrita, the doctrine is a radically critical doctrine, very critical of caste. Not only critical of caste, it's also very perceptive. It realizes that the way Hindus tend to defend themselves against Islamic power is to treat Muslims more or less as untouchable. You use the apparatus of separation in a certain sense against the Muslim, right? And he is very critical of both. Right? At the same time, if you looked at Navadvip as a city where I grew up, the city was as caste-oriented and caste-ridden as any other city in Bengal. It was totally Brahminical structure. So Ambedkar could say that, you give me the evidence of this kind of alternative or critical thinking. What is the evidence of that critical thinking in the way people actually live in the social structure? And I think that history is interesting because periodically you find a movement which opposes that. But after some time, the thinking does not disappear. I think Indians are very tolerant about alternative thinking. Indians are not tolerant about alternative living, right? And so because of that, what happens is that after 50 years, there would be re-Brahminization of those religions themselves. So if you look at the Chaitanya movement today, if you ask, what about the history of Bengali Vaishnavism? If you look at the intellectual history, of course, it is full of ideas which are fascinating and critical sometimes. But if you look at the sociological practice of Bengali Vaishnavas, it's not very difficult, for the worst form of Brahminical society. So I think Ambedkar has an answer to that in a certain sense.
Works of Ambedkar, one caste genesis and the other one is origin of untouchability. How is it that you've untouched, you remain untouched about the origin that he explains in the second article itself, while which is a historical explanation that he gives?
I'm not untouched by that, in the sense that it is something which is very powerful, but from that we do not get the kind of empirical, descriptive, historical account that we have of a real historical process. So that is something which makes me think that there is a tendency in Ambedkar himself actually comes back again and again and again to that, which is not true only of Ambedkar. And in a sense, to invoke genealogy to understand, thinking about the past in India in the 19th and 20th century, you will find many, many nationalist thinkers doing that. If you take somebody on whom I have written, Bankim Chatterjee, he has many fragments about the history of the Bengalis. He wants to look for something in Bengali history. He looks at a place, he finds something, but it's not decisive. So after 10 years, he comes back to it again, right? And goes on doing that. I find that sort of thing in many strands of Indian nationalist thinking or modern Indian thinking. And I think that there is something like that in Ambedkar. It is not, you can interpret it two different ways. You can say that there is an evolution of thinking in Ambedkar where he goes from arguments which are more inchoate to arguments which are more decisive and solid, and we take that as the history of the origin of untouchability. My reading of it is not like that. My reading of it is that it's more unstable, it's more undecisive. He constantly comes back to these things. And remember one thing, which is linked to the response that I just made. Caste is a matter of practice and social order. And Ambedkar is very, very conscious of two things. He is thinking about, Hindu scripture should be analyzed closely because I think it's fascinating in many different ways. On the one side, he uses them as his evidence. He uses things from Manu, he uses things from others. But at the same time, he is also very aware of somebody. Let me give you an example. I haven't come across this directly in Ambedkar, but Ambedkar was hugely well read on this because this is something that he comes back to again and again and again. And he's a supremely intelligent man. So I'm sure he must have known about this. But I'll give you a quote from Shukraniti. Shukraniti says, I think in different editions, the editions that I use, it's in the 30th shloka, in the first part of Shukraniti. It says, it's defining caste, jati. And it says, na jatya brahmanaschatra, that is atra, that is in this world. Caste is na jatya, not by jati, that is not by birth. Jati is used here like that. Na jatya brahmanaschatra. Nakshatra, Vaishya Evana. That is not, so fixing caste by birth should not be applied to Brahmin, should not be applied to Kshatriyas, and should not be applied to Vaishyas. Then it does something which is more interesting. It says in the second part of the shlok, Na Shudro, not to the Shudras, Nacha by Mlecho, so it's aware of a world where there are mlechas, nacha by mlecho. So none of these people should be fixed into caste by their birth. How should they be fixed? It says bhedita, that is divided, guna karma bhi, that is by guna and karma. And if you read the text, you will find that the text actually goes on with that kind of argument. So Ambedkar has to face the potential argument from the other side, which would quote something like this, because you could quote things like that from even the Manusmriti and some of those other texts. So in those cases, he would say, I think quite rightly, that you should not expect a textual picture of a society to be the historically true picture of the society. So there's a tension, not a tension, it's not a tension, because for an intelligent person, it's not a tension. To say that, for instance, if you take the example of the Quran, which I discuss very often because my department also has a very big Middle East component with my students. And the Quran in one part would say, kill them wherever you find them. So all the opponents of the Muslims would pick that up and say that this is what your religion says. But in another part of the Quran, it would say that, religion is not a matter of coercion, not merely of not of violence. It's not a matter of coercion. It's an unconstrained change of ethical heart in a certain sense, which is a religious conversion. So Akbar, for instance, would say that if there's a contamination either of incentive or of coercion of any kind in a process of religious conversion, then it's not a religious conversion, right? So Ambedkar is aware of that kind of argument as well. So it goes in two different directions. And so my response to you would be that, at least in Ambedkar is a very prolific writer. He comes back to the questions again and again. It's somewhat like reading Marx or any of the big thinkers, that you have different strands of argument first, and secondly, you can come to different types of judgments about the totality of the work. So my judgment about the totality of Ambedkar's work is that it has that iterative quality, rather than a quality of an evolution, towards a kind of definite, decisive conclusion at the end. But you might disagree, in your reading of Ambedkar.
Yeah, let us continue this discussions. Since I have to have some other meeting, in fact, I postponed for this lecture. As part of the university distinguished lecture, we would like to honor Professor Sudipta for this occasion. So, Professor Sudipta Kaviraj, we are really honored for your presence in the university, sir, for your lecture. In fact, I am also felt very happy to attend your lecture and listening to the different dimensions of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's struggle. So this is one of the areas which is close to my heart, though I am science background, but I could follow and I could really relate with the questions of Madam and other people that they have been asking. So I missed this next part, but I would like to honor you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
I just wanted to continue this because the centrality of the argument that I found in your entire lecture is of disputing he's actually disputing the entire work that he has generated in the second, which is the explanation of the origin of untouchability itself. So by not having touched that area, by making the claim that Ambedkar has in fact not come into this account of explaining the origin or the archaeology of untouchability through that discourse, it is in fact completely setting aside without going through without any proper methodological perspective. That's what I would like to state. And also Shukraniti, when we quote, in fact, as cast, in fact, Ambedkar tried to at least date this origin of untouchability. But Shukraniti, if you can date, that would be welcomed.
Okay, that is a certainly plausible view of Ambedkar. But when I read Ambedkar, as I said, I don't get that kind of a definitive understanding of the origins of untouchability. Origins, of course, generally, of course, he is trying to point to certain events and certain trends in Indian history which lead to the creation of something like untouchability.
This is related to the issue which Prashant is raising. I think the second text, this is the who are the Sudras and who are the untouchables, both dealing with the question of origins. I think Ambedkar is consciously aware of the problem which you are pointing it out. There's a difficulty in reconstructing the history in terms of putting together what is the origin of untouchability. In fact, in a paragraph, he is actually mentioning that this reconstructing history is a similar nature of a painter or an architect or archaeologist, like archaeologists trying to put together some broken stones and etc. So he is very consciously aware of the difficulty of the task which he is undertaking. That is one. And in my understanding that origin question, he understands, the question of broken man, which you mentioned. I found that kind of explanation. Many of the story, for example, even I can even think of Marx. Marx talking about the origin of societies, primitive communities, commons, all kind. So similar kind of a narrative which is available in Ambedkar in terms of how this broken man separated from their families, respected families, and defeated in the conflict, wandering across the society and settle outside the villages with an agreement of safeguarding the villages in respect, getting some kind of subsistence. So that's a kind of explanation which is there in the origin of who are the untouchables. That is one. The second one, I'm more interested in you are raising some of the critical points in Ambedkar. That's about things which are not interesting, either Marxism or liberalism. You mentioned about some of the questions. I was also thinking about the text one which you mentioned. This is annihilation of caste. One of the interesting things about the text, in a way which in a kind of transcends certain kind of problems from Marxism and liberalism, I found is the way in which Ambedkar tries to place the relationship between the question of equality and liberty. Traditionally, both in Marxism and liberalism, these two are understood to be antithetical to each other. Whereas in the annihilation of caste text, keep on insisting that without equality there is no liberty, without liberty there is no equality. Both are understood to be complementary each other. This is a comment. And I would like to ask this question that, since the first text which you mentioned is of a young Ambedkar, almost in his 20s, writing for academic conference paper, and the later texts are of a different kind, in fact performative in certain sense. Is it possible to think about like Althusserian distinction of Marx, like humanist and early kind of Marx, then you have this kind of political economy. Is there a way in which we can bring a distinction of Ambedkar's early writings and later writings?
These are very good questions. I would respond because the questions are very important to the second and the third comment. The second comment I find very important also for a different reason. I just gave a lecture. I gave 5 lectures at Jamia over the last 2 months on, the title was Political Theory and Historical Difference. And partly, I started out by saying that we have a tendency, because of our exaggerated respect for European theory, and any theory which is produced by Indians, whether Ambedkar or Gandhi or Tagore, etc., we tend to value them much less. I think if we look closely, we shall find there's a lot of innovativeness in modern Indian thought. So I disagreed, with Partha's position, for instance, his first book. But in fairness, you must understand that it was a very early book by Partha. But Partha's book, Nationalist Thought on the Colonial World, it had a subtitle, Derivative Discourse. But Partha points out, I think quite legitimately, whenever we get into this discussion, because every year we teach, students would bring this up. And Partha always smilingly says something which I think is true. They say that you must notice that there's an interrogation mark after derivative discourse. But I think if you look at the argument of the book, you'll find the argument of the book does not stress the interrogation mark very much, because his general argument is that Bankim and Nehru, they are very derivative. It's Gandhi who is not derivative. I have thought a lot about this, partly because we teach together, and it's a question which comes up again and again. I now feel that we can think of innovativeness. I'm responding to your remark about Ambedkar because I think it's a very, very important remark in two different ways. One way of being different from the Europeans is to have different starting points and to say that I don't start from liberal starting points. I don't start from Marxist starting points. I start from a Sanatani starting point. You should not always take it on trust, because I think for Gandhi, you should never believe what he says about the sources of his thinking, because very often he would say, I'm a Sanatani, and then he would say something which no Sanatani would ever say. Well, let me give you an example of that. If you think about what Gandhi says regarding widow remarriage, when I followed it for the first time, I was very startled. Initially, I thought that he must be coming out with some kind of a slightly conservative position on widows. What is his response? He says that I think at bottom, there's no question of widow remarriage. Think of a situation concretely. A girl who is 2 years old is married, within quotes, to a boy who is 6 years old, or let's say 15 years old, right? Now, marriage is a social ceremony which sanctions sexual relation between a man and a woman, right? So this is not a marriage. Until the girl actually grows up, etc., it should not be called a marriage. So the girl is 4 and the boy died, right? And you would then start thinking whether this widow should be remarried. So he says she was not married for the first time. So how do you start thinking about her remarriage? So his point is that the question of widow remarriage, putting it that way, is a false way of understanding the problem itself at a very elemental level. Now, this is not a conventional way of looking at either widowhood or remarriage or anything involved in this, right? It's a startlingly original, totally innovative, utterly idiosyncratic way of looking at the problem, totally fresh eye. That doesn't mean that I agree with Gandhi's thinking or solution about everything. I'm giving you just an example of how misleading it is when Gandhi says, but sometimes Gandhi would say that I'm a Sanatani, so this is my Sanatani thinking. What I'm saying is that there is nothing Sanatani about this kind of thinking. But, coming back to my point, I think there is a second way in which people are very innovative, can be innovative, and we have simply no eyes to see that. I'll give an example, and this would come straight to Ambedkar, where I think Ambedkar is really, really very innovative. Liberalism, socialism, they start as doctrines, but ultimately they become what I call languages. Languages in the sense of being something like an alphabet, right? So there's no unity to the English alphabet. If you say what is the meaning of the English alphabet does not carry any meaning, right? But a sentence that you compose by taking elements from the alphabet and putting it together does carry any meaning. So liberalism after some time becomes something like an alphabet, right? So Locke has liberalism of one kind, Dewey has liberalism of a different kind. So it becomes an alphabet. Similarly, Marxism, socialism becomes an alphabet. So you can be a Stalin within that alphabet, you can be a Gramsci within that alphabet, you can also be a Pol Pot within that alphabet, right? So the thing is, so if you start from this position that historically theories become alphabets or they acquire an alphabet-like character, then the question is that when you draw a theory, this is something that I call now a kind of transversal movement in history. That you have a historical universe where the theory arises and tries to settle questions there. And then you pull that theory, across the historical divide into a different historical universe, which is colonial, right? Totally different from the metropolitan universe of European modernity, right? So this is something which I call transversal because it's movement from one universe into another. Now, there the questions are quite different. I think what he says about the Marxists is quite true, that they are into a theory which was very good at analyzing inequality of a particular kind in the European universe. Caste is also inequality, but it's not an identical form of inequality. So you pull it into this world, then you have to be innovative, you have to adapt to it. And his criticism of Indian Marxists is that they are not sufficiently adaptive. But what he does is, he draws the alphabet of liberalism from the Anglo-American world, but he starts working in a world which is totally different, right? So he has to innovate. And I'll give you another example. Think of something which has become completely old hat now, but it also shows a deep fault with us as the people and as an intellectual culture. Any student who does political science today at the BA level or the MA level, learning liberal political thought, they would be reading the works of Will Kimlicka, Chandran Kukathas, and a lot of people who are liberal, but who say that there is no incompatibility between liberalism as a doctrine and group rights, right? Now these people are considered innovative thinkers, great new thinkers who open a new field or open a new elaboration of liberal theory. If you look at the Constituent Assembly debate, not only Ambedkar, what are these people doing? These people are basically saying we want to have a liberal constitution, right? Individual right, committed to individual rights, but we have a society where just having a liberal constitution based on individual rights would not work, would not suffice, right? We have to have group rights. And instead of putting it in the language of conventional academic political theory, they are doing innovative thinking with that. And if you read Ambedkar's lectures in the Constituent Assembly, he's writing about group rights. I think he is actually one of the first thinkers in the world trying to push this question that what shall we do in negotiating the relationship between rights of groups and rights of communities, right, within the context of a liberal constitution. I think Ambedkar is a very, very innovative thinker from that point of view, right? So I think the task of Indian political theory for people like us, who are merely academically trained political theorists, I think one of our major tasks is to go into that body of thinking and to then, try to go into it philosophically more clearly, more rigorously, and try to bring out the insight that you have embedded in the form of a discourse of political practice, into a more theoretical form, and then present it to the world of political theory. So instead of that, what we do is we totally concede to the idea that only in the 1980s and 1990s in Canada, when they start having difficulties, with the Quebecois and others, they start thinking about group rights or community rights, which is historically not right. And if you rewrite the history of liberalism on this point, I think Ambedkar would become a major thinker. But we do not do that. So that's something which I find very interesting. What was your last point? I've forgotten about that, sorry.
Young Ambedkar and
Sorry?
since your lecture was the first essay which were talking about was about young Ambedkar who was in 20s writing an academic paper.
No, I understand that. I don't think in Ambedkar I find that. No, I find something else, however, in Ambedkar, which is very interesting. You will see that in this paper, I'm trying to explore if my general hunch is right at the start. You can disagree with that. You can say that, you have exaggerated the futuristic orientation or the presentism of Marxism, liberalism and socialism. Then we can go in different directions. But if you generally agree with me that there is a kind of presentism and futurism, which is very strong in case of both liberalism and socialism, then that raises a question that, when that body of intellectual resource is not able to give you either concepts or hypotheses or structures of argument, where do you get the resource from? Partly, you can get the resource from the alphabet. Now, going back to the idea of alphabet, by elaborating the alphabet, using the alphabet in ways, which are innovative, which people have not done before. What if that the alphabet is so strong in certain things, it has some such strongly defining qualities that you cannot get that, even by elaborating the alphabet in different ways. Where do you look? And I think somebody, I hope, some student sometimes writes a thesis on Ambedkar's reflection on different religions. Because at various points in his life, he considers Islam, he considers Sufism, of course he considers Buddhism, right? But all these are essentially attempts to look into a religion, to look for a language not of emancipation. Now, I think the language of using the term emancipation is slightly misleading, because religion does not want to emancipate. The emancipation is a modern conception, right? But religion wants to dignify people. Emancipation is a language of dignity. Religion also has a language of dignity, which is a different kind of language, right? If you think of Tulsidas or if you think of Kabir, most importantly, it is a language of conferring dignity on people who do not have dignity. But it's not a language of emancipation. It doesn't say a word about, we would throw this out, we would, break our chains, etc. That's not the language. But I think, so the fact that Ambedkar looks into these religions, I think should be interpreted a bit more broadly, not just a response to Hinduism, which religion would be better than Hinduism? Is it Islam, Sikhism or Buddhism? And ultimately settling for Buddhism. I think it probably comes from something which is deeper, which is the sense of inadequacy of modern languages. The question that I was asked, I think there is something there. And so it's a pity that we have so little about Ambedkar and Buddhism, except for his own, the Buddha and Marx, and some of his late writings where he directly deals with Buddhism, or some of his discussions about untouchability, history of untouchability, who are the Shudras, the origin of untouchability and things like that. But I wish he had written a bit more about this kind of attraction to a religious language, but I also feel that there is an immediate recoil from a kind of religious language in Ambedkar, because Ambedkar is a strict modernist. And that's why I made that very trite remark at the start, that for him, liberalism means two things. Liberalism means a completely uncompromising critique of religion in a certain sense, right? In the Enlightenment sense of the term. And also, liberalism actually means a completely uncompromising investment in the principle of liberty, principle of freedom. So I think that is a very interesting question. But it's not, I don't think it's, Ambedkar seems to me to evolve in terms of two stages, which can be differentiated very, very clearly. I think there's a tendency in Ambedkar to come back to something, because he's an extremely busy political figure. So he doesn't have the luxury of people like us to sit at the table and spend 3 years reading books and looking at a question. But I think this question of what language is adequate, for this kind of suffering, I think it's a deep question in Ambedkar. But I do not know how this can be, how people can write about it. Actually, in the paper that I have, I have sections on who were the Shudras and the origins of untouchability. I didn't read that. So I think there is a kind of, as you said, I think there's an evolution there. He's making the argument fuller and broader, and he's using new kinds of evidence. But the evidence are essentially textual evidence, right? So there's a movement there. I see that as a movement rather than as a rupture. In case of, let's say, Marx or Wittgenstein.
May
No,
But, to the shlok which you quoted of where birth should not be the basis of the caste. So how would you see the incidents of Eklavya and Shambhuk, which the scriptures also tell us where they had to meet down a certain kind of oppression? Because in my opinion, just quoting this shloka and stating that the caste is not by birth itself, and it's on the basis of the qualities which you possess in the lifetime. So that would be a very softer way of putting down the question and also lessening down the atrocity which the caste put onto the whole range of society. So what is your take on it?
No, my take is, I think you have misunderstood what I was trying to do with that quote. No, I was not meaning to say with that quote that there are strands of Hinduism which are much softer on caste systematically, etc. There are strands of Hinduism which use caste in a different way. You can go into the Shukraniti and ask, why is he saying that? He's saying that partly because it's a much later text. It's a different kind of world. And you will also see that he is concerned about a very narrow set of questions. Because Shukraniti, if you look into the details, Shukraniti is essentially a kind of manual of a ruler about his administration. Who should you appoint as the doorman? Who should you appoint as the guardian of the arms depot? Who should you appoint in this and that, etc. And there's a general argument that don't try to expect good functioning only on the basis of caste. Because if you do that, then you would be disappointed. So try to do it on the basis of what you have seen of that particular individual, in the course of his career and things like that. So it's a totally pragmatic argument. And you cannot use that to say that the Hindu society is not based on caste. So that was not my point. Ekalavya and Shambhuka, etc., I look at it very differently, in the sense that, of course, Ekalavya and Shambhuka can be seen like that. If you think that what is happening inside the narrative is real. What is happening inside the narrative is not real. It's a narrative. And the very simple question to ask you would be that who put the Ekalavya story into the Mahabharata? The Mahabharata itself, in a certain sense. You could say, of course, there are some people who would say the Mahabharata obviously is not the creation of one man. So it is quite plausible to say that the Ekalavya story might have been interpolated by somebody later on into that. But the thing is that there's a very complicated, interested and subtle discussion about authorship and integrity of the Mahabharata as a text. But the interesting question is that if the creator of the Mahabharata wrote the Ekalavya story, right? The Ekalavya story is actually meant as a foil to the relationship between Drona and Arjuna, right? We did not put that story into the tale. The tale actually gave us the story, right? And so my reading of that is, for instance, if you take Draupadi, I was giving a lecture on the Mahabharata in Ashoka the other day. So I was telling them that what is interesting about Draupadi, because Mahabharata, my paper is called Mahabharata as extreme aesthetic, because there is a kind of extreme character to the way in which the narrative is set up in different ways, right? So all the people in the Mahabharata war, they all die, right? So no ordinary war actually leads to the death of every single warrior. But the Mahabharata creates a war where it's like that. The Mahabharata creates a scene or an incident of humiliation of women. So the worst humiliation of women is rape, right? But the Mahabharata wants to create a narrative incident where a woman who is the most beautiful in the world, etc. So see the logic of pushing it towards an extreme in a certain sense, to is subjected to something which is worse than rape in a certain sense. And I think that is why there is an intervention by the divine, so that it is so inconceivably immoral that it should not be allowed to happen even fictionally, right? But it proposes that. So, and my argument is, at least my reading of the Mahabharata is, that you must ask, what is the story doing by this? Right? I think what the story is trying to do is what the Kashmiri theorists tell us about great stories, that the great stories try to charm you narratively by telling a story which is a gripping story and a story which startles you, right? So taking revenge is not unusual. Taking revenge in war is not unusual at all. But Bhim sort of sitting on Dushasana's chest and not only killing him, but drinking his blood. Drinking his blood is an excess. It makes me think, what would have happened if Bhim did not drink his blood? What would have happened if Draupadi was simply threatened with ordinary rape, and not this kind of visual rape in the totally male world? Think of the situation that it creates. In fact, it's a world like this where they're all men sitting, and a woman is dragged in here to be disrobed. And everybody is sitting there and looking and finding extenuating circumstances of all kinds, right? So it is the author of the Mahabharata who does that. So my argument, I will discuss with Draupadi from a different point of view. That she is the most beautiful woman in the world. She finds Arjun hitting the target, and she is delighted. There's a wonderful, wonderful description of Draupadi after Arjun has hit the target. She does not speak, she doesn't smile, but she is radiant. In fact, there is some kind of, indefensible happiness, which is expressing itself through her bodily, but without any expression, right? That kind of thing. So she meets a man she thinks she can love, and by the end of the day, she is actually married to 4 other people whom she did not desire, whom she didn't want to live with, etc. But now she is burdened with the responsibility of being chaste to all 5 of them, right? And at the end, when the Mahabharata story ends and Draupadi falls, Bhima asks Yudhishthir, why did she fall? Because she led a completely flawless life. And Yudhishthir gives the most absurd answer. Yudhishthir says that she was supposed to love all of us equally, and she did not. She loved only Arjun. Right? Any reader, any sane reader of the text would actually say, what are you saying? That if you understand the human character, if you understand humanity, what are you saying? I think what the text is doing, it's saying that it's actually putting a burden on her. On the one side, she has to pass the test of love. On the other side, she has to pass a test of completely impossible test of chastity, right? Of 5 people. How can you do that? So I think what the epic texts do, to my mind, particularly the Mahabharata, is to push us narratively into a situation where something happens which is very startling. So it shocks us, right? But after shocking us, what it does is not just keep on entertaining us, it shocks us in a way where it shifts us into the path of thinking. We start reflecting, what is the meaning of chastity? Right? What is the relationship between chastity and love? Right? Which we would not have done. What is the relation between just expectation of revenge, because my wife was disrobed in public, right? And drinking somebody's blood. Is drinking somebody's blood in revenge for that is right or wrong? If it is wrong, right, then is something, even in revenge, in something like that, there are certain limits which should not be crossed. So it constantly pushes us to think about that. So I look at the Ekalavya story like that, because the Ekalavya story is actually the foil to the relation between Drona and Arjuna. And I don't think we should believe that the person who wrote the story and the people who read the story at that time, they did not have the question that we have. I think it's the writer of the Mahabharata who incites that question in us by putting the story there. It's a long answer to your question, but I think it was a good question.
Sir, during the talk, sir, when we were giving your speech, sir, that time you said something about Ambedkar and the political language. You said that point about the Ambedkar and political language, and you mentioned there that there was a fundamental difference between modern and pre-modern language. Sir, by this point that you mentioned the fundamental difference between modern and pre-modern language, sir, did you say that Ambedkar was very much opportunist when there were many political developments in the country during that period of time, and he thought that this was the time when the marginalized section of society can make their own future?
I couldn't understand the last part of your question.
Sir, I said that, sir, you mentioned the point about Ambedkar and the political language. In there you mentioned that there was a fundamental difference between modern and the pre-modern language.
Yeah.
Sir, I was thinking that, sir, to this point, sir, you said, sir, would you like to say that when there were many political developments going in our country during that point of time, he was opportunist in one view that now the marginalized sections can come in the forefront of Indian society and all?
Opportunistic in what sense?
Opportunist such as, sir...
that he saw an opportunity. He saw an opportunity to argue that...
No, I am saying that, sir, means I am saying like that was Ambedkar seeing it as an opportunity?
Ambedkar certainly was not an opportunist in the ordinary sense, because I think there's an extraordinary, extraordinary sense of resolution and extraordinary sense of purpose in his life. So, but the modern and pre-modern, what I meant by the modern and pre-modern distinction is that there is a pre-modern language of thinking about the political world, and sometimes I am asked in my own work or in discussion. I'll give you an example, concrete example. Some people tell me that when you are discussing art or literature, you very often use pre-modern languages of aesthetic. Just as I did today, I mentioned rasa and chamatkara, etc. And they say that, however, when you are writing about politics and democracy, you simply don't make any mention of any pre-modern language. So why is that? I think it's for a simple reason, and I'm sure for Ambedkar also it was for that reason, that he rarely used anything from the pre-modern language. Because the pre-modern language is a language which comes out of and that describes and evaluates a world which is of a world of pre-modern power. Right? Fundamentally different from the world of modern power, of a constitutional state, of struggles to establish democracy, rights, opposition of, the opposition between rights of one group with another, opposition between the rights of the individual and the group, and things like that. There is no amount of modification that you can do in the alphabet, again going back to my language, in the alphabet that you get, let's say, the Manusmriti and the Arthashastra or the Shukraniti, etc., to use that to understand the modern political world. So that's why I think we can learn that language to understand history, but I don't think you can get very much by using that language to understand the modern world. So I'm not surprised at all that Ambedkar did not draw anything from that. However, from that point of view, the last part of his life, the conversion to Buddhism, is something which is very intriguing. Because, I have read some of the stuff that he wrote around that time, looking for a clue to why he was doing that. Because in a certain sense, you could say that, what more do you want? Because he is the great representative, as I said, of a radical form of liberalism. when we say radical form of liberalism, we must also remind ourselves it's quite conventional in our society to think of liberalism not as a radical doctrine, to think of liberalism as something which is moderate, slightly conservative. Socialism is a radical doctrine. So when I call Ambedkar a radical liberal, there is some interesting complication in that, because it shows that in certain contexts, for the life of certain groups of people in history, liberalism is a radical doctrine, right? So I'm not surprised that he turns to that. But Buddhism, the turn towards Buddhism, I find very, very intriguing and interesting, because it is saying that all my achievements. Some people could say, I have heard some lawyers who are very sympathetic to Ambedkar, saying that Ambedkar was simply too impatient. He constructed the constitution. He should have known that it would take 30 years for the effect of those laws to be seen in society. You cannot see the effect of a law of that magnitude and of that kind of, profound significance of your society in 3 years, 4 years. So he was actually wrong in feeling disappointed after 5 years that I do not see any consequence of this. So they would say, very sympathetic to Ambedkar, but they would say that Ambedkar was wrong in the temporality of his expectation of the consequences of constitutional change. But even then, I think it does not explain, the turn towards Buddhism. So I think there is something which is deeper there. It could be some. I have some colleagues who are great admirers of Gandhi. I'm less of an admirer of Gandhi generally, but on that question, I think Gandhi has an important point. It could be that Ambedkar's relationship with Gandhi is very bitter all his life, and so therefore, in a certain sense, it is a missed dialogue, because if Ambedkar had responded to Gandhi more directly and more, more, how should I put it, not so dismissively, I think that would have generated something which is very profound. Because look at Gandhi's argument, which might explain, why Ambedkar turns to Buddhism. Gandhi's argument is, what is eradication of caste or untouchability? Eradication of untouchability is not the passing of laws where people are threatened by the state and the police, and they do not perform what they really want to, right? So Gandhi's argument famously, and they said that many, many times, the moment the police actually turns his back or the policeman leaves, you go on doing what you wanted to do. So that would not lead to eradication. It might lead to suppression of a certain kind, and I do not like suppression, Gandhi would say, but it's certainly not eradication. So do not expect to eradicate caste by passing laws, even making a good constitution. That's the Gandhian argument. I think there is something very powerful in that argument. Because if that argument had been false, then Ambedkar should have expected consequences in 5 years, right? So it could be that Ambedkar feels frustrated that in spite of all his life work going into the making of the constitution, right, he could not see any consequence, and he gets frustrated by that, demoralized by that. But it could also be that he thinks that there is something else, a dimension which cannot be captured by modern languages like liberalism, but it could be by religious languages like Buddhism. So I would like to see more sustained and more detailed work on that. I haven't seen much thoughtful work. We can all be startled by that, but beyond startlement, I haven't seen much explanation.
May I?
Yeah.
You were fascinated as your students in 1974-76, and even more fascinated today listening to your lecture. We have a first decade GNUites here, and G. Sudhir IAS, he is Chief Secretary, has just arrived some time back. He's sitting at the back, yes. His classmate, as you know, Jay Shankar, Foreign Secretary, who retired, and
sure.
Chaya Ratan.
I would not have recognized him.
Chaya Ratan, unfortunately, her mother passed away. She couldn't come. IAS, Chaya Ratan. Sir, I have lost track after GNU. I've been in a different field of activity.
That's okay.
So, yeah. but I was fascinated by some questions.
The world would not have worked if everybody became a
Yes,
professor.
yeah. So, thank you. As you have been saying that the Western thought was given much importance, political thought. But as you said, our Indian political thought. Do you see the Indian intellectual political thought in the present, in the recent past and the present, giving solutions to not only problems in India, but also the world? Because what we see in USA, the most powerful democracy, the political thought is actually, I mean, it's crazy listening to the debates there. So can we provide lessons to the world? Because ours is a very ancient civilization where representative democracy existed in some form or the other. Thank you.
You know,
Is it related?
Sir, when you talk about the tone of writing, why do you think the tone is important when you are reading this? And another one is on a clarification about the presentism and the futuristic orientation the liberalism and socialism has. So, what do you mean when you say the philosophical materialism leads to the expedient presentism?
okay. Yeah, I was trying to, I have a long section there which I cut down, so it might have become too terse. So let us start with the question of presentism. Should I answer him first and then come to yours? What I was trying to explain was very simple. I was simply trying to point to something which is well known in the evolution of Western political thought, that if you are a religious thinker, Christian thinker, let us say, you would think that if you assume that God is both omnipotent and kind, right, then to have political security, to live with dignity as a human being, in face of political power, right, what you should do should be to implore God, right? But Hobbes's argument, I think Hobbes is the first modern thinker from this point of view, but you also get elements of this in Machiavelli. They are basically saying that you can believe in God, you can believe that God is omnipotent, etc. But you should not believe that he is omnipotent in the sense that he intervenes in everything that happens in the world. Muslims have had long debates about this for a very long time. What does it mean to say that everything is intended by God? So if I stumble on the street, is that because God intended it? And things like that. So they basically said that, this is something for which you must find a mundane recourse, a mundane arrangement by which I can escape that, because it seems that God's mercy is not a reliable protection from oppression by secular power. So I was making that point, that the materiality of the universe is related to that. Why is tone important? I believe that tone is important to anyone who wants to understand how language works in the world, right? Isn't it important everywhere? For instance, if I say something, I want to say something nasty to you, I can say it in a way which seems to be otherwise all right, but I can actually convey it by tone. So if you want to understand the meaning of something, then you must actually have a theory of language which captures both the meaning side and the excess tonal side. There is a formal theory today, in fact, the theory of John Austin, who says that the meaning of a sentence is partly locutionary, partly what he would call illocutionary. That's not just a question of tone, but let me give you an example. His example is of a policeman who is walking by a pond where some youngsters are skating on the ice in a pond. And the policeman actually calls to them and says, the ice is thin there, right? So he does not say that do not go, right? So he basically is, if you look at the locutionary part is a statement about the ice, right? But the illocutionary part, what is important about what he's saying, the reason why the children would not skate on that side, if he says that, is because of the illocutionary part, which is not said but meant, which is that you should not go to that side. So what I'm saying is that all language, carries this aspect, which you can, following Frege, you can call the tonal aspect, or following, it's not really tonal. In fact, what Austin does is a distinction between two sides of the meaning aspect of language. But tone, I think, is very, very important. And what I wanted to convey to you at the start is that I think in Ambedkar there is a tone. There's a tone of grief, which I think if you look at the persuasion of linguistic acts, what persuades people? What conveys the meaning to people? Sometimes the meaning, I'm not saying that Ambedkar himself actually, while writing, wanted to convey a sense of grief. But I think there is a kind of sense of grief in Ambedkar's thinking about Indian history, and that grief gets conveyed as a tone. So that's why I thought that, the tone is important. Coming back to your question about whether we should do something to instruct the world, I don't think anybody should try to instruct the world. I think we should be more modest, and I'll quote you another Sanskrit shlok, which is a shlok from Vaishnavism. It's not a contentious shlok, but it's simply, and again going back to the question of Buddhism, I think this is an idea which is a Buddhist idea that sort of travels into Vaishnavism. But the shlok that I'm quoting to you is a shlok which is legend believes that it was composed by Chaitanya. So who is describing who is a Vaishnava? So it says, Trinadapi Sunichena, that is somebody who is lower than the grass. Trina is the grass. Trinat api Sunichena, Taroriva Shahishnana. That is, he should be as tolerant as the tree. Taroriva Shahishnana. And then he says something which is very beautiful. It says, Amanina Manadena. That is, he is an Amani. He does not demand honor from people. He does not demand honor from people, but he gives honors to others. So he has to be an Amani, but he has to be Manada. So if I interact with you, if you have done something which is good, I should immediately recognize that and give you honor for that. But you should not crave for honor yourself. So he is Amani, but Manada. Amanina Manadeva, Dena, Kirtaniya Sadahari. He should always chant the name of Hari. So I think there is something very profound and beautiful about this. I don't think we should try to instruct others. But I think if you do something good, there is a kind of logic of the mundane secular world. I am not a religious person, but I think there is something securely in the arrangement of the secular world which would actually give you returns if you do something well. It's the task of other people to recognize that. And I think if you look at the wealth that we have in Indian political thought in the modern period, I think there's a lot there which, if we articulate it well now, in a more philosophical, more academic, and more generalizable form, right, which can be understood easily, by the rest of the world through a kind of common language, I think we would get that kind of honor without demanding or asking for it. And yeah, and I think there's one thing, however, which strikes me very powerfully, which is just a recording of a historical fact. I think we were very lucky, which might have also been our misfortune. We had been very, very lucky at the time of independence, because I think it's crucial for any society. I'm actually saying that with what is happening to my society today in mind, directly. But also this has happened for quite some time, not just today. I think in a society, if the society needs to be well ordered and progress and do justice to itself, etc., you need a coincidence of political power and intellectual creativity, intellectual ability. You must put together somehow, people who hold political power and people who can think well. I think we were lucky. I'm using lucky in a deliberately ironic, paradoxical sense, that at the time of independence, we had a long list of people. The obvious people are Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar, people like that. But think of also, the second and third line of people under them, like Rajaji or many, many others in the national movement, who actually combined the task of a political leader and task of an intellectual thinker in themselves, in individuals, which I think was a fortune in a certain sense, but it is also a misfortune in a different sense. That you cannot expect that forever, you would have people like that. And so I think one of the major problems that I find in our society now, that is an increasing separation between the wielders of political power, and political power has become more and more powerful in many ways, both politically, economically, and in other ways, and the power of the state, and the people who think in the society in many different ways. Thinking meaning, I'm not meaning people like me. I'm meaning people who think in, let's say, industry, or people who think in technology, or people who think in big institutions and things like that. People who think in the NGOs. So I'm using a conventional Gramscian notion of thinking, right? People who direct social initiatives in different contexts, right? I think if the relation between political power and thinking has becomes totally oppositional in a society, I think it's a great misfortune for that society. And I think we are actually going through a situation like that. And the other problem, which is just a corollary of that there has also been a kind of academization of political thinking, which I don't think is very healthy for a society. My father was also a professor and taught history. He was a Marxist, much better known than I am in Bengal, etc. But he was somebody who did his history as an academic historian. He wrote continually for the Communist Party, partly on political issues, partly on cultural, literary issues, etc. Right? So his intellectual practice was inside the academia, but also outside the academia. My intellectual practice is completely imprisoned inside the academia, and also I suspect the kind of language that I speak, when I teach in the class, or when I'm very intently thinking about something, the language becomes more and more technical, and it becomes more and more specialized, which becomes a hurdle in a certain sense to communicate with people outside. I'm not saying that I'm going to give up that language, right? But I'm simply saying that these are some of the problems of intellectual life that we should think about. That the academization of serious thinking, I don't think is a very good thing for society. If it is only that, I think the difference between us and America would be that in America there is this kind of specialization or professionalization of thinking in the academic world, but there is also a lot of sort of public presentation of those types of thinking in the public sphere. People write a lot of that kind, write popular books. If you read the New York Times, the op-ed page every day, would have 3-4 articles which are worth reading about, etc. So I think there's something happening to our society in terms of our intellectual life, which we need to think about. And we are, part of the specialized intellectual life of society. So I think it's actually more our professional responsibility to think about that.
That was quite an, we can carry on over tea. That was quite an illuminating talk by a thinker who says that he's not well versed and he's not a scholar of Ambedkar's ideas. So part of your talk, all of us, I'm sure, will carry back with us and think about the things you have said today, you have brought to us. And with that, I want to request Dr. Shahji to come and propose a vote of thanks before we close.
Professor Sudipta Kaviraj, Distinguished Speaker of the Day, Honorable Pro Vice Chancellor, Professor Prakash Babu, who is not there right now, Professor Manjari Kajju, the Head Department of Political Science, distinguished guests, faculty colleagues, and students. At the outset, I thank Professor Sudipta Kaviraj on behalf of University and on behalf of the Department of Political Science for accepting our invitation to visit the University of Hyderabad and deliver the distinguished lecture. It was indeed an erudite and a thought-provoking lecture. The ideas put forth by Professor Kaviraj are really refreshing. I can sincerely say that our students and faculty have been immensely benefited out of listening to you. Our department deeply value your scholarship, and your visit to department is a great honor for all of us. I'm once again thanking you. Thank you, sir. I also take this opportunity to thank the Pro Vice Chancellor for accepting to preside over the function today, and also facilitating the invitation to Professor Sudipta Kaviraj to the university. I also take this opportunity to thank university officials, Pro Vice Chancellors, Registrar, and PRO especially for coordinating this program on behalf of the university. I also thank heads of departments, political science and sociology. It's a joint program by Department of Political Science and Sociology for initiating the effort to have a distinguished lecture by Professor Sudipta Kaviraj in the department. I also thank Professor Arun Patnaik for taking the initiative to coordinate on behalf of the department. I place on record my gratitude to all colleagues, faculty colleagues and students who have attended the distinguished lecture today. Last but not the least, I thank all the distinguished guests who have come from different parts of the country. Some of them came from Chennai and Guntur and so on and so forth. And also we have a lot of guests from within the city. Thank you to one and all. Thank you so much.